All right, moving on to part two of this traits topic. Going to be talking about factor models in this video, specifically the big five. Make sure to keep following along with that activity. So if you recall from the first video, we're talking about the nomothetic approach here, which is basically trying to classify or use the least amount of traits possible to efficiently classify personality and people, right? And so one common way of doing that is through statistical approaches to try and find overarching traits, and that is where we get these factor models from. So yeah, with this approach, coming up with a list of traits that are then further examined for underlying relationships that, if found, are turned into the dimensions or factors. And so we started out in this research with a lot of traits. Alport identified about 17,000. That was narrowed down by both Cattell, who narrowed it down to 171, and Eysenck, who narrowed it down further to 3. Typically today, approaches discuss there being 5 or 6 different factors. Oops. And so an example of this is extroversion. And so you can think about this in terms of there being various traits that are very highly associated with each other, like being outgoing, friendly, talkative, and when we combine various traits like this, we get that extroversion personality dimension or factor. I think the best way of thinking about this is through some sort of a hierarchical organization. And so we see this in terms of there being a hierarchy of behaviors or responses here, traits, and then types, the type being the dimension or the factor. And so with those responses, or behaviors, we can associate those with certain traits, right? So those who are sociable typically have the responses of smiles when meeting strangers, and additionally, they'll be more likely to actually go up and greet strangers. Additionally, you can have the trait of being active, which is associated with things like taking part in sports or various activities, as well as going to parties. And then this high association that is found between being sociable and being active leads to that personality dimension or factor of extroversion. And make sure to maybe even pause the video now and answer that activity question that has to do with this. You'll just do the same thing that you see here, but with conscientiousness. So with 5-factor models, again, with these factor models in general, but with the 5-factor model here, this is based on statistical approaches that take traits and create overarching dimensions from them. So there are, based on this 5-factor model, there are 5 underlying dimensions. This is a very prominent theory in the field. This one that's talked about quite a bit. There are many, at this point, there are quite a few different measures that try and get at, where everyone individually is at with the big 5 traits. One of those options is the NEO-FFI, and actually you can fill out a measure of your own big 5 traits on that activity. But with these factors, the 5 factors, one way that I find helpful with remembering which factors are a part of the big 5 is just they spell out ocean. So the first is openness. This is associated with things like being creative and being willing to go out and try new things. Conscientiousness is more about being organized and I'll fix that. Doing a thorough job. Extroversion, those who are extroverted tend to be more talkative and outgoing. Those high in agreeableness get along with others typically. And finally, neuroticism. This isn't talking about like clinical neuroticism. This is just more emotional, so emotional stability. And so those who are higher in neuroticism are you'll see larger mood swings in those individuals. And so yeah, go ahead and fill this out on your activity. And just take note that any item, when you're scoring this, any item that has an R next to it is reverse coded. So in other words, 1 will equal 5, 2 will equal 4, and 3 will just be the same and vice versa. So if you put down a 5 when you're filling it out, when it's scored, that'll be a 1. And typically with this measure, when you're looking at the final results there, anything below 25 is going to be pretty low in terms of having that trait. So if you have a 25 on extroversion, that's suggesting that you are likely not very extroverted. So just want to go through quickly some evidence for the big 5 factors. The example here is with neuroticism, and so those who are classified as neurotic, having that neurotic or are high on that neurotic dimension, tend to get more upset, and especially tend to get more upset by negative interactions with others, and that leads to certain coping tendencies that we see here. So in general, those with high neuroticism, as the amount of negative interpersonal exchanges, so interactions with others, as that increases, we also see an increase in the average number of drinks. And so oftentimes those who are higher on this neuroticism dimension, you'll see coping strategies to deal with these negative upsetting feelings. You'll see coping through things like alcohol and drugs. We also see differences in those who are typically happy versus unhappy and what traits they might be more likely to have. So those who are classified as happy here, we see that they typically have substantially lower levels of neuroticism, trait level neuroticism. But on the other hand, they will have higher levels of extroversion and a small effect, but still an effect of higher levels of agreeableness, and then really small effects, not much going on here in terms of conscientiousness and openness. With conscientiousness, there are links to achievement. This makes sense, right? I mean, if you are high on this conscientiousness trait or dimension, I should say, then you're likely to be more organized and to do more of a thorough job on whatever the task is. And so it's not too surprising that that leads to higher amounts of achievement. And so conscientiousness does seem to be predictive of things like higher GPA, even when controlling for standardized test scores. Interestingly here, results suggest that in college, women tend to overperform relative to their standardized test scores, whereas men do the opposite. They tend to slightly underperform relative to their standardized test scores. And this seems to be, at least in part, due to conscientiousness differences. Women tend to be a bit more conscientiousness. We'll talk about this a bit more actually at the very end of the class when we talk about some gender differences. And I talked about briefly in the first video of traits, how kind of similarly to the emotion discussion that we had, there is potentially an issue about whether these traits or dimensions are actually measuring psychological reality or whether they're just a description of our language. There is some substantial evidence to suggest that the big five and these factors are actually a thing, that they actually are getting at measuring psychological reality. Some of this evidence comes from heritability. And so, the most common way of going about doing various heritability studies is through research on twins. And so findings from these studies suggest that there's about a 50% shared relationship between genetic makeup and personality type, providing some evidence for the actual success of these big five factors. Additionally, these factors do seem to be stable over time, which does provide evidence for traits, right? Because these aren't supposed to be things about an individual that are changing based on each situation. These are supposed to be pretty consistent across time. Now, there are some changes throughout development, but typically they aren't massive in terms of, for an example, usually once someone is extroverted, that will be relatively consistent across time. However, as I mentioned, there are some of these developments as we age, and providing substantial evidence for these factors. This development does not appear to be culturally bound, and so, for an example, across cultures, there appears to be less openness with age, suggesting that this is not just an American measurement per se. It does seem to be relatively accurate in terms of measuring psychological realities across cultures. All right, that's it for this video. In the third and final video about traits, we'll just go over some other potentially more contemporary approaches to traits.